Fight!
Street Fighter II offered players 8 selectable characters representing 6 nations from around the world, and to one extent or another, each of them represents a kind of stereotype. You have Guile, the super serious American military dude. You have Zangief, a Russian who is a literal bear wrestler and whose signature color is, of course, red. You have Chun-Li embodying the beautiful Chinese girl trope that was so prolific in manga, anime, and video games of the time. And then you have Blanka, whom we're told is from Brazil, but who really doesn't seem to represent all that much of Brazilian culture. He's a big green monster who howls like a beast and who can conduct electricity through his body. Blanka is, to put it bluntly, a weirdo, even among the eclectic mix that is the Street Fighter canon. What the hell is he supposed to be? How did the people who made Street Fighter II come to decide that this guy, of all possible options, made sense in that original 8-character lineup? And as I ask in the title to this video, if his name is Blanka, why is he green? These are questions I hope to answer in this video essay, which is being done in conjunction with Thrilling Tales of Old Video Games, a video game history website that, as of the publication of this video, is still pretty new. Of all the stories I have up on the site so far, I thought this one, all about Blanka, would be the one people would find the most interesting. Just because these are questions I've had about this character ever since I first played Street Fighter II in my local arcade decades ago. In fact, if you think this video is interesting, check the links in the description because I actually researched the origins of all 12 characters appearing in the original Street Fighter II, the 8 initially selectable ones and then the 4 bosses. For the most part, I focus on where they got their names, and there is a story behind all of them. For the majority of them, we've got people from Capcom saying definitively on the record how these iconic characters ended up the way they did. Blanka is the one character that Capcom has said the least about, and to answer the question of why he's named Blanka is to tell the story of how the design for this character came about. So here we go. The earliest sketches for what Street Fighter II's lineup will look like show a very different game compared to what we got. This image gives the 8 default fighters as the following: Masaki Kakuta from Japan, Ji Lee from China, Bonobo, a capoeira fighter from an unspecified country, Dick Jumpsy, an American boxer and clearly a play on Jack Dempsey, Tahir Meyer, a masked fighter from an unspecified country, former Green Beret Shilka Moeller from an unspecified country and inexplicably seeming like a play on the name of a famous female athlete from Germany, the Great Tiger from India, and finally Anna Baby, an African fighter. Which is to say that, no, Capcom did not initially intend to make playable Ryu or Ken, who had both been introduced in the original Street Fighter. It's pretty easy to tell that Ji Lee evolved into Chun-Li and that the Great Tiger eventually became Dalsim. The rest more or less fell by the wayside, though Anabebe did indirectly evolve into Blanka. Now, if you are looking at Anabebe and thinking, Jesus, that does not look like the kind of thing that would end up in a video game today, you're right. In fact, it wasn't appropriate to put him in a video game even back then, Capcom would eventually decide. It actually gets even worse when you learn that his backstory has him being, quote, raised by lions and, quote, shackled in chains. And while him being shackled is especially bad, it's actually a design element that may have actually found its way into the finalized design for Blanka, so put a pin in that for a moment. The concept for this character wasn't just pulled out of nowhere. Another character named Anabebe existed in the manga Jungle King Tar-chan, and this is a thing you see again and again, not just in Capcom video games, and not just in video games in general, but in video games, anime, and manga, where a character's name or design is just plucked from somewhere else and repurposed for a new thing. In a way that you could either characterize as being an homage or a ripoff, though your value judgment doesn't change the fact that this is a thing that happened a lot and still happens today. Does it mean a given character is somewhat derivative of an existing one? Sure. But it also makes the pop culture archaeology of unearthing the layers of reference and inspiration a lot of fun to dig through like we're doing in this video. So Capcom nixed this horrible Anabebe design and moved forward with other ideas for what they termed a Beastman. Why a Beastman, though? Much in the way that Capcom has acknowledged that the beautiful Chinese girl trope was one that was just omnipresent at the time, thus leading to the inclusion of Chun-Li in the lineup, Akira Akiman Yasuda gives a quote in the book The Art of Street Fighter that explains this. Looking back on it now, it might seem bizarre that we ever had a man-beast slot in our roster, but at the time it was an indispensable part of any great martial arts shonen manga, from Ashita no Joe to Tiger Mask. It's interesting that he mentions Tiger Mask, because there are 2 characters from that manga that seem to have contributed to Blanka's evolving design. The title character seems to have inspired a version of Blanka that I'm going to call Tiger Mask Blanka, who actually looks a lot like the Tekken character King, who also clearly owes a creative debt to Tiger Mask. And then there is Gorilla Man, a supporting character in Tiger Mask whose backstory shares a lot of beats with Blanka's. And also, sure, maybe one Beastman looks like another, but you gotta admit, their faces kind of look sort of similar, especially in the earliest versions of Blanka's design in-game. As far as Ashita no Joe, it seems like Yasuda is probably referring to the character of Haramao, who, like Blanka, attacks by biting and flying through the air, cannonball style. I have not read these manga, but I actually learned about this comparison from the Twitter account Fairly Frequent Fighting Game Facts, and that's also where I got the images that I'm putting in here of the characters looking like Blanka. So I would recommend you follow that account, link in the description of this video. You may be looking at these Blanka prototypes and thinking, oh, it's interesting how they're not really from Brazil at all. And I would agree with you. I think Blanka is nominally from Brazil, but he's not representing that nation's culture in the way, say, E Honda is repping Japan. More than anything else, Blanka is representing the natural world, and that world just happens to be located in Brazil, if that makes sense. I liken this to two characters in the Samurai Shodown series, Tam Tam and Cham, who are similarly beastmen, or I guess beast people, who hail from a place that this series terms Green Hell. Unlike most characters in the game, their homeland doesn't correlate to a real-world location. It's not even tied to a concrete geography. In some games it's in South America, and other games it's in Mesoamerica. And aesthetically, it looks like a mishmash of a lot of New World cultures. Blanka represents the Street Fighter universe version of that. A place that's green, but also wild, dangerous, and closer to the animal world, regardless of which continent it's actually being put on. It's actually not unlike Street Fighter's sister series, Darkstalkers, where the representative for Brazil is also green, also a sort of beastman, and his background is also a wild, dangerous forest, even if he's a fishman. Speaking of fishmen, though, if there's any reason that Blanka ended up repping Brazil as opposed to any other country that boasts a wild green space, and there's a lot of them, it may well go back to the NES title Pro Wrestling, which features a character who's green, who has a mouth full of sharp teeth, and whose moveset includes a hold where he bites his opponent's head, just like Blanka does. This character's name? The Amazon, like the rainforest, which is largely contained in Brazil. The NES game comes up in at least 2 different developer interviews. In the Art of Street Fighter book, Yasuda recalls that he would play the game with Akira Nishitani, the other co-lead designer on Street Fighter 2. Quote, "The Famicom Disk System had a professional wrestling game with a half-fish type character called the Amazon. Nishitani would use this one biting move over and over again, and I paid homage to that frustration I felt during those times through Blanka's chomping action." In another book, How to Make Capcom Fighting Characters, Yasuda brings up the character again, saying, "The merman who appears in that game is of the same man-beast category, come to think of it." This forgotten Nintendo character just might be the reason Blanka ended up becoming green, actually. Because in a Capcom Roundtable interview done for the series' 30th anniversary, Yasuda noticed that the original design for Blanka had him having pink skin, which he changed because it looked, quote, disgusting. Gotta say, he might be correct. It's interesting that he doesn't say that Blanka was made green to be more like the Amazon, but the character was clearly one he had on his mind back in the day. Color aside for a moment, the design moved on to a version of Blanka that actually starts to look like the character we know and love. Quote, a large man with thick hair and sideburns who at this point was being called Hama Blanca, sometimes rendered in English as Hammer Blanca, but I'm pretty sure that is a mistranslation for reasons I will be getting to shortly. By the time the design was finalized, Capcom had shrunken the name just to Blanka. Okay, so now to get into colors and languages. If you grew up speaking a Romance language, you can probably look at Blanka's name and see that it sounds a lot like various words for white, specifically a feminine form of those words. That does seem kind of weird, honestly, because the most notable thing about Blanka is that he has green skin. What is going on here? Well, I have 3 theories, 2 that are very popular in English-speaking fandoms, but which I'm pretty sure are wrong, and then a third that's not as well known online, but which I'm pretty sure is correct. Either because it's not true or there's just no evidence to support it, the prevailing explanation in the early 2000s has since been stripped from Blanka's Wikipedia page, though debate about it still exists on the talk page and on lesser wikis. This theory states that Blanka's name comes from the Portuguese phrase homem branco, or white men, and that Blanka's original name, Hama Blanca, may itself be a warping of this phrase into Japanese and then into English. That said, a lot of explanations for this theory actually cite the original phrase as being hombre blanco, even though that's Spanish for white man and not Portuguese, which is what people speak in Brazil. According to this theory, Blanka was light-skinned before he mutated into the green electrified beast he is today, and therefore the Brazilians knew him as the white man. Here's why I think this is not correct. Beyond the fact that many Brazilian people have lighter complexions and a light-skinned person may not be so conspicuous to the point that that is the thing they're known for, Blanka does not have white skin. As long as anyone's been aware of this character, like in the fictional universe of Street Fighter, he is not white, he is green. Okay, so maybe he actually turned green gradually during the years he was like swinging from vines in the jungle and learning trade secrets from electric eels, but this is not a thing that Capcom has ever explained explicitly, like when he turned green. Besides, you'd think if people were spotting Blanka out in the wild, the whole raised by animals aspect of him would be much more interesting than his skin color, which again is green and not white. The second theory people have about Blanka's name is that it comes from a Portuguese expression referring to memory loss. The connection being that Blanka allegedly has amnesia as a result of the plane crash that stranded him in the jungle in the first place. This attempt at an explanation seems to want to connect with his ending in Street Fighter II, where he meets his birth mother, whom he does not initially recognize. I don't think this one is correct either. It actually seems like a bigger stretch than the white man explanation, specifically because Branco is not used in Brazilian Portuguese to mean a total loss of memory, so much as it is a temporary failure to remember, kind of like how English speakers use the expression blanking or drawing a blank. In any case, the series isn't super clear whether Blanka is actually amnesic so much that he maybe was just too young when the plane crashed to remember his mother in the first place. In that Street Fighter II ending, Blanka's mom recognizes Blanka because she thinks his anklets are actually ones she gave to him before the crash. Even though those anklets are fully adult-sized, big enough to fit around Blanka's beefy Beastman legs. I think this is the storyline just incorporating design elements after the fact, kind of in the same style of Capcom coming up with reasons why Blanka turned green, after they just kind of arbitrarily decided that there should be a green character because pink looked disgusting. I'd bet good money that Blanka's anklets are actually design holdovers from when he was Ana Bebe, the shackled African fighter, and they persisted through the design process long after that storyline was abandoned. Unless this ending was planned from the character design stages, I'd guess it's more, what can we do with this character, than it is Capcom baking in an anklet-centric epilogue right from the beginning. And then, thirdly, here's what I think really happened. In 1971, the new Shirahama Tropical Botanical Garden was reinvented as a leisure facility and tourist attraction called Hama Blanca. Hama from the Japanese word for beach, and Blanca allegedly a nod to the Moroccan city of Casablanca. Doing a healthy tourist trade back in its heyday, Hama Blanca retained the gardens and added a musical revue. While none of it seems especially Brazilian or even necessarily South American in focus, the traces remaining online today give a sense of a jungle paradise. Though some of the reviews did feature dancers in costumes that look like ones you'd see at Carnival at the very least. Recession caused Hama Blanca to close permanently in 2005. The buildings have been demolished, allegedly with only some palm trees remaining as proof that a tropical getaway ever existed in this spot. But as you might be able to guess, it's possible that an unlikely relic of Hama Blanca is everyone's favorite green Brazilian. As far as I've found, the only English language page connecting Blanka and Hama Blanca is the TV tropes page for Street Fighter II characters, which points out that the Wakayama prefecture is somewhat close to Capcom's headquarters in Osaka. By today's estimates, as a 90-minute train ride or an hour-long drive down the coast, which does in fact seem close enough that the folks who made Street Fighter II would have at least been familiar with the advertisements for Hama Blanca if they weren't actually going, blowing off steam from the Capcom grind by looking at flowers and taking in shows. The reason I think Blanka was named for this resort destination is that, quite simply, there's no other reason for the name he had during the planning process, Hama Blanca, to exist. The brand name Hama Blanca is a unique yoking together of Japanese and this Latinate word for white, wherein it's not actually being used to signify the color white. I suppose you can interpret the name of the resort as a fancy international rendering of White Beach, but I think more than anything, Blanka in this context is suggesting a culture beyond Japan. Something wild and green, something boasting the multicolor palette of the tropics rather than something merely white, and certainly something altogether different than its Mediterranean namesake, Casablanca. I mean, the brochures do not look how Casablanca looks in real life. In the way that Blanka the character doesn't so much capture the nation of Brazil, but just the idea of a wild jungle, Hama Blanca was painting with broad, bright strokes to give tourists a getaway to somewhere different than where they were. I have to admit that it is a gut feeling prompting me to say that this is the true source of Blanka's name, or at least a more plausible candidate than the previous two theories. I am a sucker for a good story about an abandoned amusement park, and there is something strange but kind of poetic in this aspect of someone else's pop culture nostalgia being captured in the most unlikely of places, the grunting beastman from Street Fighter II. As far as I know, this is not a connection that anyone associated with Street Fighter II has acknowledged. As my post about the other 11 Street Fighter characters mentions, Capcom seems a little freer to admit when the inspiration for a character comes from a Japanese institution, Guile's name coming from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, for example. But I have no idea if Hama Blanca being a brand name owned by someone else might prevent Capcom from admitting that it led to one of their characters. It doesn't seem likely though. Based on this, can we at least agree that Hama Blanca was most likely an incorrect rendering of that old name? I mean, he didn't have a hammer. If his name is Hama Blanca, I would expect him to have a hammer. It's just how my brain works. That is everything I could find about this character and his origins, which are, for whatever reason, slightly more obscure than the other main Street Fighter characters. Again, I'm not certain that Capcom named him after the resort, but I do think it's the best explanation out there, and at the very least one that is harder to disprove than the first two theories. As is the case with anything I post at Thrilling Tales of Old Video Games, I want anyone with evidence one way or the other to hit me up. And by the way, the best version of evidence is like direct quoted words from a Capcom staffer. I will update accordingly. Meanwhile, please do have a look at Thrilling Tales of Old Video Games. You can see the text version of this video at thrillingtalesofoldvideogames.com/Blanka. It includes links to my sources and quite a few extra bits that I shaved off for this video. But I've also got posts about Samurai Shodown, why there seems to be a level missing from Super Mario Bros. 2, and what the hell hockey pucks have to do with Pac-Man's name. Spoiler, I don't think they have anything to do with Pac-Man names. It's a weird urban legend that got started on gaming wikis. I've got a lot planned for the site, most of it in text form, but perhaps if people think this video is interesting, I'll do some videos of the weirder stuff that I turn up. Until then, thank you for watching, and I suggest we all take a moment to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how can I be more like Blanka?
A Table Cakes production.